Good evening and welcome to another The Cycling Physios webinar. My name's Tim. Bianca is not with us tonight. She's stuck in the wind tunnel with a client, improving their position there. And joining me this evening on my own is Morgan, who's a strength and conditioning coach that works with me in my other business, HP3 Coaching. So we'll come back to that later. If anybody's after some additional strength and conditioning coaching, you can get in touch with us. But Morgan is going to be talking to us today about a really, really important topic, which is RED-S, relative energy deficiency in sport. So I'm going to shut up. I'm going to step off the side and let Morgan tell you all about herself and about the research that she's done into RED-S. If you have any questions as we go along, please put them in the chat box, and then we'll pick them up as we finish off the presentation. Okay, Morgan, tell us more about yourself.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me on. I'll just quickly share my screen as I've got just a small slideshow that I'm going to present. So if we, hopefully won't keep you too long. So hopefully this talk is going to cover short-term and long-term effects of low energy availability. And also, I wanted to cover what this might mean for you as an athlete and your performance, and then potentially what you could do to reduce the risk of RED-S and low energy availability. So first off, a little bit about myself. As you can tell probably from that Australian flag, and maybe you've detected an accent. I am Australian. I moved over from Australia 10 years ago now, which it's absolutely flown by. So in terms of my education, I attended Loughborough University, where I've recently graduated with a degree in sport and exercise science, and then most recently graduated with a master's degree in strength and conditioning, where during the completion of my master's, I volunteered as an S&C coach with Loughborough Students Rugby Union and Loughborough Students Cycling Team, which is where a bit of my knowledge about S&C, RED-S, and how it links to cycling comes into play. I'm not very familiar with the endurance side in terms of if I was to be an athlete in endurance running or cycling or that kind of background. My sport is touch rugby, but saying that, I grew up playing a range of sport, and I'm pretty much interested in all sports. So yeah, that's just first off a little bit about me. So before we go into the long-term and short-term effects of low energy availability, I want to look at what is low energy availability and how does it arise. So if we firstly look at what energy availability is, it's the difference between energy intake, so the food that we eat, and exercise energy expenditure. So that's self-explanatory, the calories spent via exercise. And this represents the daily amount of energy available to sustain physiological processes outside of exercise. And this figure is thought to represent a value of 45 kilocalories per kg fat-free mass per day. So that's what we would refer to as energy balance. So if we now move on to what low energy availability is, this is something that occurs when there is a reduction in energy intake or an increase in exercise energy expenditure, which results in insufficient energy to support important physiological processes. And there has been a threshold proposed by the literature, which is less than 30 kilocalories per kg fat-free mass per day. And that's kind of the threshold that is believed to be when we start seeing perturbations to our health. So essentially, low energy availability is when our body doesn't have enough energy to support important physiological processes, and it just begins to shut down in a bid to conserve energy. So some of you may have already heard of the term RED-S, and I know Tim referred to it earlier. So relative energy deficiency in sport. And if I draw your attention to explain what RED-S is, it's a model used to describe the physiological dysregulations and the negative health and performance outcomes that are thought to arise as a result of what I discussed earlier, low energy availability. So if I firstly draw your attention over to the right-hand side of the model, where we have menstrual function and bone health, which in combination with low energy availability was originally formed the female athlete triad, which as a result has received a lot of attention within the literature. So if we look at menstrual function first, it is thought that low energy availability can result in menstrual dysfunction. So we're talking about late periods, and at the more severe end of the spectrum, complete cessation of menses. And that is also known as functional hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is characterized also by chronic estrogen deficiency. So in combination, there is thought to be a link with bone health as well, where low energy availability can also cause low bone mineral density, resulting in stress fractures, and then at the more severe end of the spectrum, osteoporosis. So that's, if we think of the athlete on a continuum of extreme rather at this end, and kind of not as extreme at this end, the athlete will move across the continuum the longer that they display low energy availability, basically. So originally, the female athlete triad, it's in its name, was thought to only apply to females. But of recent years, it has come about that low energy availability can affect males as well. And this is where we've seen the emergence of the RED-S model. So if we're to look at RED-S in males, there is increased evidence that males experience low energy availability when energy intake doesn't match exercise energy expenditure of training or competition. And especially for cyclists, both male and female cyclists represent a population at increased risk of RED-S. And this is in relation to reduced bone loading and increased exercise energy expenditure. So we could also look at other factors that could lead to LEA. Prolonged inadequate energy intake, not matching the high demands of the sport, which of course we know cycling has very high energy demands. Sudden changes in training volume or intensity, and then participation in strenuous endurance events without making nutritional adjustments. So if we now come back to RED-S as a whole, because menstrual function and bone health has received a lot of attention within the literature, the other areas that are depicted here, so metabolic, growth development, psychological, and cardiovascular, haven't received as much attention within the literature. And this is kind of where my work with my dissertation comes in. So I'm going to now zoom in on cardiovascular perturbations to health as a result of low energy availability. So what does the research show so far in terms of cardiovascular effects? So early atherosclerosis may be associated with estrogen deficiency and functional hypothalamic amenorrhea in athletes. So as I mentioned earlier, FHA is more at the severe end, so the chronic low energy availability, and that's very much a severe menstrual dysfunction. So research has also shown endothelial dysfunction, decreased blood flow, and increased vascular resistance amongst amenorrheic athletes, which are known risk factors for the development of cardiovascular disease. And then with the resumption of menses, we can see improvements in vascular function also. And then finally, lower resting heart rate and systolic blood pressure in amenorrheic athletes compared to eumenorrheic athletes, which eumenorrheic meaning the athletes have a regular menstrual cycle. So all this research is all well and good. However, it looks at the more long-term effects of low energy availability. And it doesn't really tell us how in the short term, low energy availability could affect cardiovascular health. And that's kind of where my dissertation came in. And I looked at the effects of short-term low energy availability on cardiovascular health in active eumenorrheic females. So I'm just going to go over quickly what my dissertation entailed. So we looked at, as I said, active eumenorrheic females. Our sample size was quite small, so there was only seven participants. But I should note that this was a part of a larger study, which a PhD student is currently still completing. So I worked alongside him to complete this. So as part of the study, there was 3 days of energy restriction where the participant ate 15 kilocalories per kg fat-free mass per day, and 3 days of energy balance. So that was just normal 45 kilocalories per kilogram fat-free mass per day. And during these days, they were ordered not to do any physical activity because obviously that would change the output, energy output of the athlete. So cardiovascular measures were taken both pre and post intervention. So we measured heart rate variability, arterial stiffness, blood pressure, forearm blood flow, and resting metabolic rate. And I can say that as a participant that took part in this study, the 3 days of energy restriction was absolutely brutal. So picture on the top right, you can see me. I'm just doing a VO2 max test, which was part of the baseline measurements. And then in the bottom right, that's just a picture of the restricted meal over 3 days. So the participant, that was their set menu for 3 days, which, looking at the baguettes and the cereal for breakfast, is quite a small portion, but we wanted to replicate what a period of low energy availability would look like. So what did the research show us? So no significant changes to cardiovascular health were reported as a result of short-term low energy availability, which is boring, I know, but we did take stuff from this, and it was that it is likely that short periods of low energy availability, this being less than 5 days, are unable to induce cardiovascular health perturbations. And it still remains unknown the time frame over which cardiovascular health perturbations begin. So it could be more than 5 days. Well, it is more than 5 days. But in terms of months and years, we don't know. It also told us that menstrual dysfunction, so chronic estrogen deficiency, so right at the end of the spectrum, as a result of long-term low energy availability, is likely to play a role in inducing cardiovascular health perturbations over time. So thinking back to REDS, there's definitely a interrelationship with a lot of the perturbations that we see within that model. And it still remains unknown as kind of what comes first. Does menstrual dysfunction come first? And there's kind of a knock-on effect, which results in cardiovascular perturbations. We don't know. There's still a lot of research that needs to be conducted. But I suppose what's good is it highlights the importance of education around RED-S and being able to recognize the risk factors early, so that we can prevent chronic low energy availability and further health complications. Because RED-S is reversible. So if we see the signs early, we can do things, which I'll go on to talk about, that can hopefully reverse RED-S and get us back on track and kind of reduce that calorie deficit that we see with low energy availability. So if we zoom back out to RED-S as a whole, so not looking at just cardiovascular effects, what does RED-S mean for your performance? So the literature has suggested potential indirect mechanisms where RED-S could affect performance. So if we look at increased risk of injury, that's very much linked to low bone mineral density and stress fractures. Decreased training response, impaired judgment, decreased coordination, irritability. So looking at mood, depression, decreased glycogen stores. These have all been suggested by the literature as kind of indirect ways that low energy availability could affect your performance. So it's very much an area that needs more research as well, to see if there's any direct effects of low energy availability on performance. So what can you do as an athlete to kind of mitigate these effects, reduce the risk of REDs? So resistance training is definitely one, and that's where my role as a S&C coach kind of comes in. So obviously resistance training will help with loading of the bones, so increased bone strength, decreased risk of low bone mineral density, and decreased risk of stress fractures. But not only does it help with bone health, but it also increases strength, so increased physical capabilities of the muscles, resulting in increased rate of force development, increased power output, and overall improvement in cycling economy. So it's not just RED-S that resistance training can help with, it's also the performance side. And definitely in terms of preparation, so robustness, resilience to injury, resistance training plays a large role there as well. And this can be achieved just through doing basic core exercises, body weight exercises, and then with more time, compound movements with free weights. It's very much you start at your own level, start with the basics, and kind of move along. So that's how, as an athlete, incorporating resistance training could help reduce the risk of RED-S. Also monitoring the menstrual cycle, so identifying irregularities early. So if there's a bit of irregularity with your period, you can think, oh, something's going on here. You can look at keeping a food diary or things like that to see what's going on. And then nutritional awareness and appropriate fueling. So you want to achieve a daily energy intake that matches exercise energy expenditure. And I think there's a talk coming up in a few weeks that will kind of explain a bit more of that. So I haven't really gone into much detail there. So some of you might say that in regards to resistance training, I will become bulky and it will slow me down. And I think this is a common misconception within endurance sport as a whole. So if we firstly look at the goals of resistance training for a cyclist, improve physical qualities, improve movement capabilities, develop peak and rate of force production, which, yes, will lead to lean muscle mass gain, but when programmed correctly, muscles can become stronger without being heavy. So a study on elite cyclists showed this, where a gain in thigh muscle mass was achieved without an increase in body mass. So a few takeaways from today. I feel like I have probably gone through that a bit quick. So obviously if there's any questions, please just fire away. Key takeaway: low energy availability results from a mismatch between energy intake and exercise energy expenditure, with a greater prevalence amongst endurance athletes due to increased training volume. Central to the RED-S model, as I said, was low energy availability, where a range of interrelated physiological dysregulations are proposed to occur as a result. So when looking at that model, there's a lot of interrelation between all of the strands that branch off low energy availability. So when looking at what I did with my research, it's likely that short-term low energy availability is unable to induce alterations to cardiovascular health, which is good, because if, say, you experienced a 3-day period of low energy availability and your health declined, we'd be seeing a lot more problems arising. However, long-term low energy availability in association with menstrual dysfunction may be linked to the development of early atherosclerosis. So that's looking at the more chronic long-term end of the spectrum. The time frame over which health alterations occur as a result of low energy availability remains unclear. And to be fair, it is a hard area to kind of answer questions in, because it would kind of mean that you would take a group of participants and wait for them to become in a state of low energy availability and allow them to continue to do that, which is obviously unethical. So that's a big challenge within this area. And then in terms of resistance training, it's not only important for bone health in cyclists, it can have additional benefits related to performance and injury prevention. So that's all from me. I hope I didn't go through that too quick and you were able to understand a bit of what I was trying to get across. If there's any questions, pop them in the chat and I'll do my best at answering.
Yeah, thanks very much, Morgan. We got one question come through from Jonas here, which I think we'll kick straight off with this. We're talking about is it paradoxical that we're discussing putting even more training in to the overall workload, even though it's resistance training rather than cardio training, when the problem is energy deficiency? That's a very, very good point made there. Do you want to discuss that one?
Yeah, really good question. And to be fair, when I was doing this PowerPoint, I did think about including that in. So it's very much, if you've got a coach, talking to your coach and making sure that your training is periodized so that it's all considered. And you've got a point in saying that obviously resistance exercise, it's more exercise. So I'd say that you have to definitely talk to your coach about it and make sure that your training's periodized to kind of account for that.
Yeah, so it's that difference between, as you were saying there, we can have periods of maybe a few days of low energy availability for whatever reason, but that's the difference between a couple of days of low energy versus that chronic effect. Mm-hmm. And as we know in cyclists, there isn't that bone loading in riding bikes. So we've got to try and get that bone loading elsewhere, which is exactly what you were saying, is we then need the heavy resistance strength and conditioning training. And as you were saying there again, it doesn't bulk you up. So we're trying to get away from that fear. And again, some of the interventions you're putting in for strength and conditioning can help mitigate maybe some of those short-term.
Short-term. And I think there's more benefits to doing resistance training than obviously the increased workload and energy expenditure, which when done right,
absolutely. Question coming in from Howard. Again, another good friend of the show and the team. Is there any research to suggest specific cycling disciplines may be more susceptible to RED-S, e.g. mountain bikers maybe less so due to the terrain-induced loading?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to be fair, I haven't seen anything within the literature to suggest specific cycling disciplines might have be at less risk. A paper that I kind of based a lot of my PowerPoint around was the IOC consensus on RED-S, and that explains a lot. There's a lot of good references in there for papers to read. But in specific relation to your question, Howard, I haven't come across any research in the literature.
I know Dr. Nikki Kay's done a lot of work on RED-S and was looking particularly at sort of masters level road cyclists. I believe she had a bias in that her husband was a masters level road cyclist, which is why she was looking into it. I think sort of, Howard, I know obviously you've got a lot of experience working with mountain bikers versus roadies versus maybe track cyclists. And I think a lot of what we see in terms of RED-S is, one point is it intentional RED-S or is it unintentional RED-S? And, we can often make the mistake of thinking we're eating enough to support our training when actually we're not, versus those who maybe have disordered eating, which may be then on that spectrum moving on to an eating disorder. And it's maybe an intentional. And what we see obviously with a lot of road cyclists, where weight is an issue because they're fighting against gravity, trying to get up and over mountains, that they may be intentionally or unintentionally going into chronic periods of RED-S. I wonder, Howard, with kind of your group, with sort of mountain bikers, where actually they're trying to use gravity a lot of the time for the downhill stuff, where maybe there isn't quite the same culture of trying to be lighter and lighter. And obviously track cyclists, again, trying to be as light as possible on the track is not necessarily what they're targeting. So I think, Howard, you're absolutely right. There is going to be discipline variations, but it's going to be more complicated than just that. But it comes down to the culture, isn't it, and the psychology of why did somebody end up in that situation. So 100%. It's
because it's even with other sports where we see like dancing, where it's very much an aesthetic sport, and that's where you see a lot of eating disorders because it's for more aesthetic reasons. And then you've got weight category sports as well, like boxing, where disordered eating arises because these athletes need to hit a certain weight category.
Absolutely.
So low energy availability can come from a range of ways.
Yeah. Howard's just followed up there saying he was thinking more from maybe a cross country perspective.
That's a good question.
Good question, Howard. You're probably in a better position to maybe answer that one from your background. Maybe that's another bit of research that maybe needs to do. If anyone's watching this, Howard has done a lot of work on concussion and mountain bikers as well. So I would encourage you to go and look at some of Howard's work. And again, from a nutrition point of view, with the younger athletes, Howard's actually authored a book on nutrition for young athletes. So again, if you're working with younger cyclists, I'd encourage you to look up Howard's book there. It's a really, really good resource. I think sort of on the sort of topic of maybe the whole sort of diagnosis of this is worth making the point that, I'm a physiotherapist, you're a strength and conditioning coach, whereas RED-S is a medical diagnosis, and that does require the doctors to come in because there's lots of things that can cause these symptoms. So we do need the medics to come in and through a process of elimination.
Yeah. And as I said, it's just recognizing the risk factors that then as a coach or a teammate, you can signpost people to where they need to be.
Absolutely.
We're not out here to diagnose. It's being aware. More
exactly that. It's raising that awareness and it's raising the conversation so that if, this webinars, we're targeting physios who are working with cyclists. So it's if you're having an athlete coming through in your clinic and you pick up maybe some of these signs and symptoms they're discussing, then, it's opening that conversation and maybe then engaging other members of the MDT. Do they need to have a chat with a medic? Do they need to get some blood tests done? Do they need to, go on and have a DEXA scan to check their bone health? And then maybe referring on to a nutritionist or a sports dietitian who can then explore that in much greater detail.
Yeah, 100%.
Great stuff. Are there any other questions coming through from the live feed? There's a little bit of a delay on the line, but I'll give it another second or so, see if anything else comes through. Jonas just following up with another one there. Can we say a bit more specifically on how RED-S affects the endocrine system? So yeah, really good one here. So can hyperthyroidism be related? Do you want to take that one?
I'll be honest, I haven't explored the research in relation to the endocrine system as much as menstrual and bone.
Essentially, it's RED-S, that low energy availability, it just systematically just switches off systems in the body, and it's just coming from the higher centers of the brain. And one of the things it will switch off is control of the thyroid. So often I've worked with a endocrinologist who his speciality is low thyroid, hyperthyroidism, low thyroid function. And what he realized was that the vast majority of patients getting referred to him didn't need any medical intervention. They just needed their nutrition reviewing. And that low thyroid function was simply a symptom of RED-S, or just RED in just relative energy deficiency. So sometimes we'll have people who are being diagnosed with low thyroid function or an underactive thyroid, whereas actually that is just a symptom of RED-S. And by then addressing the energy intake and increasing that energy intake, the underactive thyroid then becomes a normally functioning thyroid.
And that usually is the first point of call. You look at your diet, and then if it's severe, that's when you can look at reducing exercise energy expenditure as well.
Yeah. So again, I mean, this is just another one of the things that the medics then need to look for in those blood tests, looking at your thyroid function, looking at your bone health. So yeah, absolutely. So yeah, does that answer your question, Jonas? I'm assuming that's Jonas' abbreviated name there. Any other questions? We've just gone over the half an hour mark, so that's kind of maintained people's concentration for, I think, probably long enough.
Didn't bore them too much.
So, okay, if that's all the questions coming through from the group, you can always put more questions in afterwards, and we'll pick those up and forward on to Morgan if you want to ask Morgan any further questions on the role of strength and conditioning in cycling. Maybe we get you back on to do another talk at a later stage on actually just strength and conditioning training for cyclists, and more generally on that topic. And as I mentioned, if anybody's watching this and would be interested in getting further support or guidance on strength and conditioning training, maybe over the winter, then get in touch with us, and I'll put you in touch with Morgan, who can help you out with your S&C programs.
For sure.
So, okay, thank you very much, Morgan, for your time this evening. We've got another follow-on talk in another couple of weeks' time, again on the topic of RED-S, but this time with Liz, who is a nutritionist. So again, exploring it from the very specific nutrition element there. So hopefully look forward to seeing you all then. And yeah, thank you very much for your time. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.